A message came through from a stranger on a Tuesday night, a hospice nurse I'd never met, and it read, "I don't know how to say this gently, but I think I just found your grave, and you're clearly not in it." I read that sentence 4 times before I understood she wasn't joking and wasn't mistaken. I have a headstone with my name on it, in a cemetery I have never once visited, in a town I haven't set foot in for 19 years. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a message that shouldn't have made any sense at all, and ends with a family's carefully buried secret, finally, fully surfacing 19 years after they decided the easiest way to handle a scandal was to simply erase the person at the center of it. My name is Dara Whitfield. I'm 36-year-old. I'm 36 old, and I work as a hospital social worker. The kind of job where you spend your days helping families navigate the worst moments of their lives: death, diagnosis, difficult decisions made under pressure. I want you to hold on to that detail because the specific skills of my job, staying calm while someone else's world falls apart, asking careful questions instead of jumping to conclusions, are exactly what carried me through everything that followed that message. I need to take you back 19 years first, because nothing in this story makes sense without understanding what actually happened to me at 17. I grew up in a small town where my father held an elected position on the county commission, the kind of role that made our family's business, in his mind, everyone's business. Image mattered in our house in a specific, exhausting way: church attendance, grades, the right extracurriculars, all of it in service of a version of our family my parents presented carefully to a town that was, admittedly, watching closely. At 17, I got pregnant. I won't spend long on the details of how or with whom, because that part of the story matters far less than what happened after. What happened after is that my parents, over the course of about 6 weeks, quietly arranged for me to go live with my Aunt Louise, two states away, and told everyone in town, including most of our own extended family, that I had died in a car accident. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I've had to sit with it since receiving that nurse's message. My parents did not simply send me away in shame, the way plenty of families did back then, a story I could have made a kind of peace with over the years. They fabricated my death, fully, deliberately, with enough supporting documents that it held for 19 years without a single person outside our immediate family ever questioning it. I drove out to that cemetery myself. 3 days after receiving the nurse's message, my hands unsteady on the wheel the entire way, unsure what I actually expected to find. The cemetery sat on a low hill outside the town I grew up in, oak trees casting long shadows over rows of granite, a groundskeeper's truck parked near the entrance that I remember noting absurdly. Some small, functioning part of my brain still cataloging ordinary details, while the rest of me braced for whatever came next. Odalise had given me the plot number over the phone, and I walked the rows slowly, reading names until I found it. What I found was a real headstone, professionally maintained, fresh flowers, replaced seasonally by the look of them, my name carved into granite, my correct birth year, and a death date exactly matching the year I was sent away. Beloved daughter, it read underneath my name, in the same simple serif font you see on every other stone in that cemetery. Nothing about it designed to look fake, because it wasn't fake, not in any way the world around it could tell. I stood over my own grave for a long time, the grass neatly trimmed around the edges. Someone clearly tending it regularly, someone who had been tending it, apparently, for 19 years, kneeling down eventually to touch the letters of my own name carved into stone, half expecting them to feel different somehow than any other letters I'd ever touched. They didn't. I called the hospice nurse, Odalise. the same evening, needing to understand exactly how she'd found it and why she'd been looking in the first place. Her voice was careful, measured, n- the voice of someone used to delivering difficult news gently, but without softening the actual facts. She explained that she'd been caring for my father, who I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 decades, through the final stages of a terminal illness, and that in his periods of declining lucidity, he'd started apologizing repeatedly to someone named Dara. At first, I thought maybe it was an old friend or a sister who'd passed young, she told me. But your family never once mentioned Dara, not as someone who'd passed, not as anyone at all. It just didn't sit right with me. A dying man apologizing over and over to a name nobody in the room recognized. She'd done some quiet digging on her own time, professional instinct rather than idle curiosity, checking the local cemetery records first, since that felt like the most obvious place to start if there really had been a daughter who died young. Found the plot in about 10 minutes, she said. Then I found you, alive, on social media, close enough in appearance and age to the old photographs still hanging in your parents' house that I nearly dropped my phone. She'd sat with that discovery for 2 full days, she admitted, unsure whether reaching out was overstepping, before deciding a dying man's unresolved guilt and a living woman's stolen years mattered more than professional caution. I filed a public records request the following week, the same kind of request. I've helped grieving families file 100 times in my own job, except this time my own name sat at the top of the form. What came back was an actual filed death certificate, my name, cause of death listed as a car accident, signed by a doctor I had never once heard of, at a hospital I had never been treated at in my life. It was detailed enough, specific enough, that I understood immediately why it had never once been questioned. This wasn't a hasty lie told at a funeral. This was a legal document, filed with the county, sitting in official records for 19 years, treated by the entire system around it as simple, unremarkable fact. A local newspaper's digital archive, when I searched it that same week, turned up a short obituary from that exact year, describing a bright, promising teenager who had died tragically, complete with fabricated details about hobbies I never had and college plans I never made. Reading my own fictional obituary, written by someone who knew me well enough to get my middle name right, but invented an entire imaginary version of the life I was supposedly cut short from living, was one of the strangest experiences of my adult life. I sat in my car in a parking lot for 20 minutes after reading it, unable to drive, unable to fully process the specific vertigo of reading your own eulogy for a version of you that never existed. I went to my childhood home for the first time in 19 years the following weekend, forcing myself through the front door I hadn't walked through since I was 17, needing to see my father, who Odalys had told me plainly did not have much time left. My mother answered the door, and her face, seeing me standing there, did something complicated, shock, and something that looked almost like relief tangled together in a way I didn't fully understand yet. Her hand gripping the doorframe like she needed it to stay upright. She stepped back to let me in without a word, and the house smelled exactly the way I remembered it. The same lemon cleaner, the same faint trace of my father's pipe tobacco, even though I doubted he'd been well enough to smoke it in months. Walking through that house, I found out our old family photo album still in the same shelf where they'd always sat, the same faded floral covers, and paging through them at the dining room table, my mother hovering uncertainly in the doorway, I found gap after gap, empty triangle-shaped spaces where photo corners once held pictures of me. Some pages replaced entirely with new photographs clearly taken later, family gatherings and holidays rearranged to fill the space where my childhood had once been documented. My sister's children standing in configurations that made the missing frame around them almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. My parents hadn't just told a lie, they had physically, methodically edited me out of our family's visual record, one photograph at a time, sitting at the same table, presumably, scissors in hand, deciding which version of our family history the world was allowed to keep. I confronted my mother in the kitchen that same afternoon, my father sleeping upstairs. Too weak that day for a conversation neither of us was ready to have with him yet, anyway. The kitchen looked almost exactly as I remembered it. The same yellow curtains, the same chipped mug rack by the sink, a house frozen in time around the exact moment I'd been erased from it. I asked her, as plainly as I could manage, why? Not how. I already understood the mechanics by then. Why? She sat down heavily at the table, and for the first time in 19 years, I watched my mother look genuinely, completely undefended, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never once drank from. Your father was 3 months from an election, she said, her voice thin, staring at the table rather than at me. Sip, A pregnant 17-year-old daughter would have ended his career, and probably a lot more than that, in this town. We told ourselves a tragedy was something people could feel sorry for us about. A scandal was something they'd feel sorry for you about and angry at us over forever. I asked her if she'd ever once considered what it would do to me, being erased that completely, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering. I told myself you'd build a whole new life somewhere else, better than this town could ever give you, she said. I don't think I let myself think past that for a very long time. She wasn't excusing it, not exactly, but I understood. Hearing her say it out loud, that this hadn't been simple cruelty, it had been a specific, calculated kind of fear. The fear of a small, image-obsessed community's judgment, weighed against an actual, living daughter, and somehow, unforgivably, the fear had won. What she told me next reshaped the entire story a second time. I had been told, at 17, sitting in a lawyer's office. I now understand my father must have specifically chosen for his discretion, rather than his competence, that my baby had been placed for adoption through a private agency, a closed adoption I'd never be able to trace, even if I wanted to. I remember signing papers I barely read, numb, exhausted, 17 years old and utterly without the standing to ask a single hard question of the adults managing every part of that process around me. That was never true. The adoption was never legally completed. My son had instead been informally raised by my Aunt Louise, the same aunt I'd been sent to live with, 2 states away, growing up his entire life believing his own mother had died. The exact same fabricated story told to everyone else, told to him too, by the one family member who was supposed to be helping me. I sat with that fact longer than any other single piece of this story. Somewhere a 19-year-old young man existed who believed I was dead, raised by a woman who had watched me carry him, and then participated in convincing him I hadn't survived to raise him myself. I thought about every birthday of his I'd quietly, privately mourned over the years, believing he'd been raised by strangers in some anonymous, well-meaning family I'd never be able to find even if I tried, and understood now that the truth was somehow both better and worse than that imagined version. Better because he'd been raised by someone who loved him. Worse because that same someone had let him grow up grieving a mother who was never actually gone. Odalise, frustrated by the family's continued reluctance to fully account for what was, by every legal definition, documented fraud, made a decision on her own that set the next several weeks in motion. She posted a carefully anonymized account online describing, without names, a family that faked their daughter's death. A post meant, she told me later, simply to process her own disbelief and maybe warn other hospice workers to trust their instincts when something doesn't sit right. It spread far faster than she expected. Local commenters recognizing details about the cemetery, piecing together identities within days, the anonymity she'd carefully built collapsing under the specific small-town nature of the story itself. I found myself, within a week, watching a distorted, increasingly dramatic version of my own life circulate online without my input at all. Strangers, speculating about details they'd gotten partially right and mostly wrong. I made the decision, after several sleepless nights weighing it with Odalis and with my own therapist, to write and post a single clear, calm public statement myself, taking the narrative back from speculation rather than letting strangers finish, telling my own story for me, the way my family once had. That statement is what finally reached my son. He'd grown up 2 states away, the story went, believing his mother died before he could form a single memory of her. Raised by my aunt Louise in a small house I would only see photographs of much later, birthday parties and school pictures I'd never once been part of, an entire childhood that happened in parallel to my own adult life, without either of us knowing the other, was breathing the same air on the same continent. He recognized, reading my careful public account, enough overlapping details, ages, dates, a description of a small town, and an elected official father to understand with a certainty that must have been genuinely disorienting that the woman he'd always believed dead had just posted her own story publicly, very much alive. He reached out to me directly. 3 days later, a short, careful message that simply said, "I think you might be my mother. I don't know how to ask this any other way." I read that message standing in my own kitchen, and I had to sit down on the floor, unable to hold myself upright through the specific, enormous weight of it. I sat there for a long time before I could type anything back, my hands shaking too badly to hold the phone steady the first 2 attempts. When I finally responded, all I could manage was, I never stop wondering about you." We talked on the phone for the first time 2 days after that, both of us mostly crying rather than speaking. 4 hours on the line, saying very little of substance and everything that actually mattered. The county, once the documented forgery became public and undeniable, opened a formal fraud inquiry into how a false death certificate had ever been filed and accepted in the first place, a process that moved slowly, but with real legal teeth. Investigators pulling every original document, every signature, every filing date. It was through that inquiry that we learned the doctor who'd signed the original fraudulent certificate had, independently, already been under separate review by the state medical board for a documented pattern of loosely verified paperwork. In entirely unrelated cases, a doctor chosen, it became clear, specifically because he could be trusted not to look too closely at whatever he was asked to sign. My father, in the final weeks of his life, guided gently by his own hospice chaplain, and with Odalise present as a witness, dictated a full written account of what had happened, taking direct, specific responsibility, separate from whatever blame my mother carried, his hand too weak by then to sign more than a shaking approximation of his own name beneath it. I sat beside his bed while he told me, in halting, labored sentences, his oxygen line hissing softly between phrases, that he had spent 19 years rehearsing exactly this apology in his head, and had genuinely believed he would die before ever finding the courage to say it out loud to my actual face instead of an empty room. I practiced it in the shower, he said, and managed something close to a broken laugh at the absurdity of it. 19 years of shower apologies, and you were alive the whole time. 20 minutes down the highway some of those years. And I never once picked up a phone. I held his hand, and I didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't, but I didn't pull my hand away either. It wasn't a clean, movie-perfect reconciliation. It was two people running out of time, saying the truest things either of them had left. The false death certificate was formally corrected through the county's inquiry. My legal record restored to simply, accurately, alive. The newspaper, Baser issued a quiet retraction of the original obituary, a strange, small formality that somehow mattered more to me than I expected it to. I went back to that cemetery one final time, and rather than leaving the headstone standing as some kind of strange, permanent monument to what had happened, I had it removed entirely. The plot left simply empty because there had never been a body there to begin with. Only 19 years of a story that was never true. My relationship with my mother remains permanently changed, careful, limited. The specific distance of two people who understand. Now, you'll figure it out. Exactly how far the other is capable of going when frightened enough. My father died 6 weeks after that written confession, and I sat with him at the very end, something I never once imagined myself doing 19 years earlier, driving away from that house at 17, convinced I'd never see either of my parents again. My son and I are still, slowly, carefully learning each other, two people rebuilding 19 stolen years with no map for how that's supposed to work. We meet for dinner every few weeks now, halfway between our two cities. Awkward sometimes in the specific way strangers who share blood and history, but no actual memories together, are awkward, comfortable in other moments, in ways that surprise us both. The same laugh. I've noticed the exact same laugh, something neither of us learned from the other, simply carried forward. Anyway, Odalise has stayed in both our lives, long after the professional reason for her involvement technically ended. Showing up at my son's college graduation last spring in the third row, crying harder than either of us expected. The specific, quiet mercy of someone whose simple refusal to ignore a dying man's strange apology gave two strangers back to each other after 19 years of believing that was no longer possible. I think about that message sometimes. Odalis's careful, uncertain words on my phone screen, and the strange, disorienting relief of finally understanding exactly what had actually happened to the missing years of my own life. I don't think about it with the same sharp devastation anymore. I think about it as the exact moment someone else's quiet, professional integrity finally succeeded, where 19 years of silence had failed. The moment the truth simply refused to stay buried any longer. The moment a stone with my name on it finally, rightfully, came down. If there's a story in your own family that's been quietly, carefully edited for the comfort of telling it, I hope this reminds you that truth has a way of outlasting even the most carefully maintained fiction. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments. And if you believe patience and quiet integrity can undo even the deepest family secrets, stay close, because Sweet Payback Stories has another one waiting for you very soon.